You would never want to be his enemy. For those who stood against him, death came slowly, and it came as a warning to everyone who dared to challenge his rule. His name was Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, and his cruelty became legend. But Vlad was not only a monster of stories. He was a prince, a warrior, and a survivor in one of the most dangerous corners of 15th century Europe. His enemies remembered him for forests filled with impaled soldiers. His people remembered him for strict justice that made roads safe from thieves. And centuries later, his reputation would inspire the myth of Dracula, the vampire lord of fiction. Tonight, we will walk through his life slowly, beginning with his troubled childhood, his years as a hostage, and his rise to power in a land caught between empires. This is not a tale told in haste, but a history of a man who used fear as both a weapon and a shield, and whose story became larger than life. This is the history of Vlad the Impaler. Years of exile and uncertainty, Vlad returned with one goal in mind: to reclaim the throne of Wallachia. His homeland was a place of constant struggle, caught between the power of Hungary to the north and the vast Ottoman Empire to the south. Within Wallachia itself, noble families, the boyars, often shifted their loyalties, supporting whichever prince or foreign ruler served their interests. In 1447, Vlad's father, Vlad II Dracula, was killed, betrayed by these same boyars. His older brother was also murdered. For young Vlad, the memory of this betrayal was not something he would ever forget or forgive. In 1448, with Ottoman support, he made his first attempt to take the throne. But his reign was short, lasting only a few weeks before Hungarian-backed rivals forced him into exile once more. For most, such a defeat would have ended the dream of ruling. But for Vlad, it was only the beginning. During his years away from Wallachia, he studied his enemies carefully. He moved between Moldavia and Transylvania, gaining allies, gathering knowledge, and watching the balance of power shift. Every exile taught him patience, and every betrayal taught him how fragile authority could be. When the chance came again in 1456, Vlad seized it. With Hungarian support, he marched back into Wallachia, determined not only to rule, but to rule without weakness. This time, he would not rely on loyalty or affection. He would build his authority on fear. The boyars who had betrayed his father and destroyed his family were among his first targets. Some were executed outright, others impaled, and many were stripped of their power. The message was clear: disobedience would be punished without mercy. To his enemies, he was ruthless. To those who obeyed his laws, he was strict but just. Under Vlad's rule, roads became safer, theft declined, and crime was met with swift judgment. For the common people, life could feel more secure, even though it was secured by terror. By the mid-1450s, Vlad Tepes had risen from a displaced exile to a prince whose name commanded both fear and respect. His reign was no longer in question. He had taken back his throne, and he intended to keep it, no matter the cost. With his throne secured, Vlad the Impaler began to shape Wallachia in his own image. His rule would soon become known across Europe, not for kindness or diplomacy, but for the severity of his justice and the terror of his punishments. Wallachia was a land often torn by disorder. Roads were dangerous, theft and banditry were common, and noble families frequently conspired against their rulers. Vlad intended to end this instability. He believed that a prince must be both feared and respected, and he set out to make his authority absolute. From the beginning, his punishments were harsh. Those who disobeyed his laws faced imprisonment, execution, or impalement. Vlad's chosen method of punishment, the slow and painful death of impalement, became both his weapon and his symbol. It was said that stakes lined the roads leading to his cities, each carrying the body of someone who had defied him. To travelers, these gruesome displays were warnings. In Wallachia, crime did not go unpunished. Yet for all its cruelty, his reign also brought order. Merchants could travel without fear of being robbed. Farmers could bring their goods to market, knowing that thieves would be dealt with swiftly. There are stories that a golden cup was placed in the center of a town fountain, and that no one dared to steal it, for they knew the punishment would be worse than death. The boyars, who had once betrayed his family, suffered most under his rule. He distrusted them deeply, and his actions proved it. Some were executed, others impaled, and many were forced into hard labor, their power broken. In their place, Vlad relied more on common soldiers and loyal retainers, men who owed their positions to him alone. Vlad's reputation began to spread beyond Wallachia. In neighboring lands, tales of his brutality circulated quickly. Some saw him as a monster, a tyrant who delighted in suffering. Others saw him as a stern but necessary ruler, a man who used terror to bring order in a land long divided by chaos. The truth, as often happens, lay somewhere in between. To the poor, his reign could feel secure, because the streets were safer and justice was certain. To the nobles, his rule was terrifying, because their privileges and conspiracies were no longer tolerated. To foreign observers, he was a figure both fascinating and horrifying, a prince who held power not through alliances or diplomacy, but through the sheer weight of fear. Vlad himself seemed to embrace this reputation. He knew that terror could travel farther than armies. By making examples of those who opposed him, he extended his influence beyond his borders. His enemies hesitated. His rivals second-guessed themselves, and even powerful empires thought twice before underestimating him. This was the heart of Vlad's rule, fear as strategy. To his enemies, it was cruelty without limit. To his supporters, it was justice that kept peace. And to history, it became the legacy of a man whose very name carried the shadow of dread. By the middle of the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire was pressing steadily into Eastern Europe. The great Sultan Mehmed II, known to history as Mehmed the Conqueror, had captured Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire and making the Ottomans the most formidable power in the region. Their armies were vast, their resources immense, and their expansion seemed unstoppable. For Wallachia, a small principality caught directly between Hungary and the Ottomans, survival depended on uneasy diplomacy. For generations, Wallachian rulers had been forced to pay tribute to the Sultan in exchange for a degree of autonomy. But Vlad the Impaler was not a man who easily accepted subordination. At first, Vlad continued the payments expected of him, but his relationship with the Sultan was tense, and as his confidence in ruling grew, his willingness to submit declined. He saw the tribute as humiliation and sought to resist Ottoman control whenever possible. His defiance soon escalated into open conflict. One of the earliest sparks came when Sultan Mehmed demanded that Vlad appear at his court, a gesture of submission. Vlad, suspicious that such a summons might lead to his imprisonment or death, refused. Instead, he strengthened his fortifications and prepared for war. In 1461 and 1462, tensions broke into outright hostility. Vlad launched raids into Ottoman-controlled territory south of the Danube River. These attacks were sudden and brutal. Villages were burned, garrisons destroyed, and prisoners taken. For Vlad, these raids were not only acts of resistance, but acts of intimidation, designed to show that Wallachia was not a passive vassal. The Sultan, enraged by this defiance, responded by sending a massive force to subdue Vlad and bring Wallachia firmly under Ottoman control. The armies that marched north were among the largest Vlad had ever faced. He could not hope to defeat them in open battle. Instead, he turned to tactics of terror and psychological warfare. Vlad's most infamous act came during this campaign, the creation of what came to be called the Forest of the Impaled. According to accounts, when the Ottoman forces advanced into Wallachia, they were met by a horrifying sight. Thousands of stakes lined the fields, each bearing the body of a man, woman, or soldier who had opposed Vlad. Some were criminals, some captured enemies, and others unfortunate villagers caught in the storm of war. The sheer scale of the display was intended to freeze the advance of the Ottoman army. The sight worked as intended. Chroniclers describe how the Sultan himself, upon seeing the field of impaled bodies, recoiled in shock and disgust. Though the Ottomans still advanced, their morale was shaken. The psychological weight of fighting a ruler who employed such methods was immense. Another famous episode from this conflict was the so-called night attack at Targovishte in 1462. As the Ottoman army camped near the Wallachian capital, Vlad led a daring night raid with a small force of his men. Disguised in Ottoman uniforms, they infiltrated the camp, set fires, and attacked in the dark. Their goal was to reach and assassinate the Sultan himself. Though they failed to kill Mehmed, the chaos and terror they caused were extraordinary. Fires raged through the camp, soldiers cut one another down in confusion, and the Ottomans were reminded that even in their strength, they were vulnerable. Despite these victories of terror and surprise, the reality of the conflict remained grim for Vlad. The Ottomans vastly outnumbered him, and prolonged resistance was nearly impossible. Over time, the Sultan's forces pressed deeper into Wallachia, and support from Hungary proved uncertain. The nobles of Wallachia, resentful of Vlad's harsh rule, began to conspire against him, some even turning to his brother Radu, who had remained in Ottoman service and was favored by the Sultan. By the middle of the 15th century, the shape of power in southeastern Europe had changed. The Ottoman Empire had crossed the threshold from a regional force to an empire without rival, and its advance pressed steadily against every border it touched. Constantinople had fallen. Trade routes shifted. Courts adjusted their alliances to survive the new reality. Wallachia, the small principality that Vlad Tepes ruled, lay directly on the fault line. To the north and west stood the Kingdom of Hungary, watching the frontier, weighing every move. To the south, beyond the wide flow of the Danube, stretched Ottoman lands, fortresses, garrisons, and the long roads that connected them. For Wallachia, tribute to the Sultan was an old arrangement, a price paid for a measure of autonomy. But tribute sat poorly with Vlad. He had returned to his throne with the memory of betrayal still sharp, and he had no desire to bend his knee when fear and resolve could hold a border just as firmly. At first, he observed the expected courtesies. Envoys were received, payments were sent, letters were exchanged with the formal language of neighbors who do not trust one another. Yet, underneath these gestures, preparations began. Watchtowers were repaired. The old passes through the Carpathians were inspected. Messengers traveled quickly between towns and market villages, carrying short orders that spoke of grain stores, of horses, of iron, and of the men who could be called at need. The friction grew in small steps. A demand from the Sultan to appear at court, more a test of obedience than a true invitation, was answered with silence. Ottoman tax officers, crossing the Danube to count what was owed, found cold hospitality and unfriendly faces. Traders returning from the south spoke of a prince who would not be easy to direct. Then the quiet ended. In the winter season, when rivers ran cold and roads were hard, Vlad sent his riders south across the Danube. The raids were brief and precise. Outposts were struck at dawn. Storehouses were burned. Bridges were cut. Small garrisons were taken by surprise. The aim was not conquest, it was disruption. A reminder that the frontier could cut both ways, and that the river was not a one-sided barrier. Smoke rose from settlements that had believed distance would protect them. Prisoners were brought back, not for ransom, but to carry a message to those who watched from farther off. This prince would answer pressure with pain. The Sultan's response was measured, but unmistakable. First came a probing force, the kind sent to test an enemy's nerves. When that did not settle the matter, a larger army followed, a column of infantry and cavalry, engineers with tools for bridge work, and the long train of wagons that keep an army moving. Across the Danube they came, banners lifted, drums sounding, the discipline of an empire set against the stubbornness of a small state. Vlad could not meet such a host in open battle and hope to win. He chose the ground and the manner of the war himself. Villages along the line of march were emptied before the invaders could reach them. Grain and fodder were carted away. Wells were fouled. Livestock were driven into the hills. The roads that seemed clear on a map became long corridors with nothing to take, and no friendly faces to ask for help. By day, the Ottomans advanced and found little. By night, their outposts heard sounds at a distance, the creak of saddles, the low murmur of voices, then silence again. When a fight did come, it came from the edges. Small companies of Wallachian horsemen struck like wind, quick, close, and gone. A scouting party was cut off. A column on a narrow track found the ground ahead scattered with caltrops, and the slopes above alive with archers. A convoy of supplies burned at dusk, the flames visible for miles. The pattern took its toll, not only on men and horses, but on resolve. A march that should have felt like domination began to feel like pursuit of a shadow. Then there was the display that would be remembered above all others. The stakes. Set in long, uneven ranks, each cut from the forests and sharpened, each carrying a body lifted and fixed in place as a warning. There is no number that can rightly measure it, and the chronicles that tried to count only turned shock into arithmetic. What mattered was the sight, the raw wall of it, stretching across fields and near the approaches to towns, so that any road taken would pass by what the prince considered proof. Disobedience endured in Wallachia, but not for long. The Ottoman advance did not stop at the first such field, or the second. Armies are made to keep moving. Yet the speed of the march slowed, and with it the certainties that had set it in motion. Officers who had expected quick submission began to speak more carefully. Men who had expected soft resistance began to tighten their ranks at dusk. A campaign measured by distances on parchment was now measured by effort, by the weight of fear at the edges of the camp, and by the way a man looked over his shoulder when the wind moved the grass. The most daring moment came at night near Targovishte. Using darkness as his ally, Vlad rode with picked men into the sleeping sprawl of the enemy's encampment. Some wore enemy colors to pass the outer ring. Some carried torches to throw where fabric and rope would take a quick flame. The plan was simple and ruthless. Strike hard toward the command tents, sow confusion, and make the camp devour itself in panic. When the first fires rose, orders were shouted in many directions at once. Horses screamed, ropes slashed. In the confusion, men fought men who could not clearly see one another. Whether the blade ever reached the Sultan's own tent is less important than what followed. The certainty, carried by rumor at dawn, that no place was safe, not even the heart of the camp. Still, an empire is not undone by a single night. The Ottomans regrouped, counted losses, pulled their lines tighter, and moved on. But the night attack stayed with them, an ember that would not die. To the soldiers, it was a story to tell quietly. To their commanders, it was a line in a report that weighed more than it seemed to. As weeks stretched, the cost of the campaign rose in ways that were not recorded on lists of the fallen. Food grew scarce. Water had to be guarded. The summer air grew heavy, and with it came sickness, ordinary exhaustion turning into fevers that traveled from tent to tent. The Ottoman timetables, set by planning and calculation, began to stretch. And always, just beyond the edge of vision, moved the riders who would not stand and would not flee, who struck where the line was thinnest and vanished where the forest closed. Inside Wallachia, life narrowed to the essentials. Villagers sheltered in the hills. Church bells were used for signals. Messengers rode by back paths between strong points along the Argash and the Yalomitsa, carrying orders that were little more than a few words. Hold, hide, burn, wait. At Poenari, the stronghold on the ridge above the river, lookouts watched the approaches and sent word down the line when dust on the horizon suggested movement. Vlad understood that terror worked in more than one direction. He showed it to enemies in the open, but he also directed it inward, toward those among the boyars who measured advantage by the day, and who might be tempted to shift their loyalty if the empire pressed hard enough. A prince who had been made by will and fear would not be unmade by doubt. The punishments continued, not as spectacle for its own sake, but as a reminder that while the invaders could occupy a road, they could not occupy a man's thoughts if those thoughts were bound by dread of his ruler. Beyond Wallachia, news traveled swiftly. In German lands, printed sheets told of the impalements in language that grew harsher with each retelling. In Italian courts, letters arrived that spoke of a frontier prince who set the border alight rather than bend to tribute. In Hungary, the story was more complicated. Vlad was a useful wall against the south, but a difficult ally, one who chose his own methods and sent his own messages. Praise and caution arrived in the same envelope. The Sultan's council weighed the costs. They had marched to punish a vassal and to set the Danube frontier in order. They had found a land emptied ahead of them, a prince who would not stand and be struck down, and a war that refused to behave like a single battle. They pressed as far as sense allowed, then began to draw back, leaving behind garrisons where they could, promises where they must, and threats where they felt they needed to be remembered. When the great host withdrew, it did not mean Wallachia was safe. Power abhors a pause. The moment an empire steps back, rivals step forward. Within Vlad's own circle, men counted their chances. In Ottoman camps, his brother Radu, once a companion in childhood captivity, now a favored client, was measured as a gentler hand for the same throne. In Hungarian halls, calculations were made about what kind of Wallachia best served their border. One ruled by iron fear, or one ruled by a prince easier to advise. In Italian courts, letters arrived that spoke of a frontier prince who set the border alight rather than bend to tribute. In Hungary, the story was more complicated. Vlad was a useful wall against the south, but a difficult ally, one who chose his own methods and sent his own messages. Praise and caution arrived in the same envelope. The Sultan's council weighed the costs. They had marched to punish a vassal and to set the Danube frontier in order. They had found a land emptied ahead of them, a prince who would not stand and be struck down, and a war that refused to behave like a single battle. They pressed as far as sense allowed, then began to draw back, leaving behind garrisons where they could, promises where they must, and threats where they felt they needed to be remembered. When the great host withdrew, it did not mean Wallachia was safe. Power abhors a pause. The moment an empire steps back, rivals step forward. Within Vlad's own circle, men counted their chances. In Ottoman camps, his brother Radu, once a companion in childhood captivity, now a favored client, was measured as a gentler hand for the same throne. In Hungarian halls, calculations were made about what kind of Wallachia best served their border. One ruled by iron fear, or one ruled by a prince easier to advise.
Yet in that season, when the dust finally settled on the roads south of the Danube and the scorched fields began to show green again, Vlad held something that could not be easily taken by decree. He had shown that a small country, guided by a will that would not yield, could bruise an empire simply by refusing to play by the rules it preferred. His methods were condemned and whispered about, but they were also effective, and that effectiveness echoed more loudly than the judgments that followed. The legacy of the campaign was written in more than reports and letters. It lived in the minds of men who had marched through a land that seemed to reject them at every step. It lived in the memory of a night when a camp turned on itself under fire and confusion. It lived in the calculations of noble families who had learned that a prince could make terror do the work of armies. And it lived in the name that began to travel far from Wallachia, Tepej, the Impaler, half description, half warning, a single word that told an entire story. But success at the frontier did not end the trials of rule. If the empire had been kept at arm's length, the cost at home was deep, a court thinned by punishments, a countryside exhausted by flight, and allies who measured every decision against their own survival. From such conditions, new dangers rose, less visible than banners on a riverbank, but no less deadly. The next chapter of Vlad's life would not be written in raids and night attacks. It would be written in betrayals, in captivity, and in the slow turning of fortune that visits every prince who rules by fear.
The victories that Vlad claimed against the Ottomans were striking, and the terror he created in his enemies became legendary. Yet, as often happens in history, triumph carries with it the seeds of downfall. For while Vlad had forced an empire to hesitate, he had also drawn the attention of rivals, both within and beyond his borders. who began to see opportunities in his growing isolation. Inside Wallachia, the boyars, the nobles whom Vlad had punished so harshly, did not forget their losses. Many of their families had been broken. Their estates had been seized or diminished. Some had fled across borders, seeking protection under neighboring rulers. Others remained in Wallachia, but quietly waited for a moment to strike back. Though Vlad's fear kept them outwardly obedient, hatred smoldered beneath the surface. To the south, the Ottoman Empire continued its designs on Wallachia. Sultan Mehmed had not accepted permanent defiance. Though the campaign of 1462 had stalled, the Ottomans did not abandon their aim of bringing the principality firmly under control. They now looked to Vlad's younger brother, Radu, who had spent his youth in Ottoman captivity alongside Vlad. Unlike Vlad, Radu had chosen loyalty to the Sultan. He was polished, charming, and far more willing to cooperate. To the Ottomans, he seemed the perfect alternative, less brutal, more agreeable, and willing to serve their interests. So it was that the political currents began to shift. Nobles discontented with Vlad saw in Radu a chance to recover their privileges. The Ottomans saw him as a reliable partner. Even some among the people, weary of the harsh punishments and constant fear, thought perhaps a gentler hand might ease their burdens. One by one, support for Vlad weakened, while whispers for Radu grew louder. Meanwhile, Vlad looked north to Hungary for support. He had long relied on Hungarian backing to hold his throne, and he considered himself a defender of Christendom against the Ottoman advance. He hoped that King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary would see his struggle as part of a larger war, and that aid would be given. But here, too, the ground shifted. Matthias was cautious. His kingdom had its own concerns, and Vlad's reputation for cruelty made him a difficult ally to champion openly. In European courts, pamphlets describing the prince's atrocities had begun to circulate, painted in lurid detail. Some exaggerated, some true, but all carried the same message. This was a man as monstrous as the enemies he fought. When Vlad sought aid, Matthias hesitated. Instead of providing full support, he turned to another solution. He arrested Vlad. By late 1462, the prince who had terrified an empire found himself taken into custody, transported not as a ruler, but as a prisoner. He was carried north into Hungarian lands, where he would remain in captivity for many years. The details of his imprisonment vary across sources. Some claim he was held under guard, but treated with a measure of respect, allowed a household and even some degree of freedom within his confinement. Others describe harsher conditions, painting a picture of chains and cells. What is clear is that Vlad was removed from the stage of power. His enemies in Wallachia rallied around Radu, who now claimed the throne with Ottoman support. Yet imprisonment did not erase Vlad's name. In fact, during these years, his legend grew larger. The stories of his cruelty spread across Europe, retold and reshaped in countless ways. In the German lands, printers produced pamphlets filled with tales of impalements and atrocities. These accounts, some based in truth and others wildly exaggerated, fascinated readers who lived far from the Balkans but were eager for tales of horror and warning. In their eyes, Vlad became less a political figure and more a symbol, a ruler whose justice was so severe that it bordered on madness. Ironically, while these stories blackened his reputation, they also ensured that he was never forgotten. His name became known not only in Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, but across Italy, Germany, and beyond. Princes, bishops, and merchants spoke of him. Some condemned him as a tyrant unworthy of Christian support. Others admired his defiance against the Ottomans and argued that his cruelty was the price of holding the frontier. Meanwhile, in Wallachia, Radu ruled under Ottoman favor. His reign, though longer than many of his brothers, was not without its difficulties. He faced rebellions, shifting loyalties, and the ever-present shadow of his brother's name. For though Vlad was imprisoned, he was not gone, and the memory of his brutal but decisive rule lingered in the minds of many. During these years in captivity, Vlad is said to have converted to Catholicism, aligning himself more closely with Hungarian politics. Whether this was genuine belief or a strategy for survival is hard to know, but it fit the needs of the moment. He needed to be seen as useful again, as more than just a prisoner whose reputation stained the courts of Europe. The years stretched on. A decade passed, then more. Vlad remained in custody, watching the tides of politics shift without him. Radu continued to rule, though never with the same terror-driven authority that Vlad had commanded. And yet, beyond the walls of his confinement, the story of Vlad the Impaler grew larger than the man himself. When the moment came that Hungary once again needed a strong hand in Wallachia, Vlad's name would resurface. His captivity, long though it was, would not be the final chapter of his reign. The prince who had been betrayed, feared, and condemned would one day return. But the Wallachia he came back to would not be the same, and neither would he. By the 1470s, the political landscape of Eastern Europe was shifting once again. The Ottoman Empire remained a constant pressure, pushing steadily northward. Hungary, under King Matthias Corvinus, continued to balance its resources between holding the frontier and strengthening its influence across the region. In Wallachia itself, leadership was unstable. Princes rose and fell with unsettling speed, installed by either the Ottomans or the Hungarians, each trying to control the land between them. In this environment of uncertainty, Vlad's name returned to the stage. After more than a decade in captivity, he was no longer young, no longer the fiery warrior prince of earlier years. But he was still a figure who commanded attention. His reputation, dark, terrible, and unforgettable, made him a man both feared and useful. The opportunity came when Radu, his younger brother and longtime Ottoman ally, died in 1475. With Radu gone, the Ottomans sought new candidates for the Wallachian throne. At the same time, Hungary saw a chance to place a ruler who might hold the line against Ottoman expansion. Though Vlad's years in prison had stained his record, he was still remembered as a man who could enforce order in Wallachia with unmatched severity. In 1476, with Hungarian backing, Vlad returned once again to Wallachia. His restoration was brief, but it carried the weight of a final chapter. He reclaimed the title of voivode, the ruling prince, for a third and final time. The Vlad who returned was not the same man who had once filled fields with impaled enemies. He was older, hardened by years of captivity, and shaped by the knowledge that his reign could never last without constant vigilance. Yet his methods had not softened. Chronicles suggest that he resumed his stern justice, punishing betrayal and seeking to impose order as swiftly as possible. But the ground beneath him was less secure than before. Wallachia remained divided. Some nobles supported him, grateful for Hungarian protection. Others resented his return, fearing that the cycle of terror would begin again. The Ottomans, of course, could not accept his rule. To them, he was an enemy who had humiliated their armies and refused their tribute. They quickly moved to restore a more loyal candidate to the throne. In the late months of 1476, Ottoman-backed forces advanced into Wallachia. Vlad gathered what men he could, relying on Hungarian support and his remaining loyalists. He fought with the same determination that had defined his life. But his resources were thin, his alliances fragile, and his enemies numerous. The details of his final battle are unclear, lost in the shifting reports of chroniclers. Some say he was ambushed near the forests of his homeland, surrounded by forces too great to withstand. Others claim he fell in open battle, leading his men as he always had, refusing to flee. However it happened, his end came swiftly. Vlad the Impaler, the prince who had ruled through fear, was struck down in the final struggle of his turbulent life. Even in death, his story did not lose its mystery. Different accounts disagree on what followed. Some claim his body was decapitated and his head sent to Sultan Mehmed as proof of his defeat. Others suggest he was buried near the monastery at Snagov, though excavations centuries later offered no certainty. His grave, like much of his life, remains clouded in legend and uncertainty. What is certain is that Vlad's final reign was brief, perhaps no more than a few months, yet it cemented his image as a ruler who never truly surrendered. He had returned from captivity to claim his throne one last time, and though he fell quickly, his persistence left an enduring mark. In the end, Vlad Tepes ruled Wallachia 3 times. His life was a cycle of rise, fall, and return, always dramatic, never peaceful. He lived as a man who believed fear could hold a kingdom together, and he died as a prince who refused to be forgotten. When Vlad the Impaler fell in battle, his body lost to confusion and his grave uncertain, his story did not end. In some ways, it was only beginning. Death can close a life, but for certain figures, it opens the door to something larger. A legend that grows in the telling, reshaped by each generation that repeats it. Vlad Tepes was such a figure. His memory became part history, part warning and part myth. In Wallachia itself, the people who had lived under his rule remembered him with complexity. For the poor and the powerless, there were stories of safety on the roads, of thieves punished, and of markets where merchants no longer feared to display their goods. They told tales of justice delivered without hesitation, of a ruler who could be trusted to defend his land against invaders, even if his methods were merciless. For the boyars, the noble class that had so often resisted him, the memory was darker. They recalled executions, confiscations, and punishments that stripped them of privilege. To them, he was a tyrant whose power was built on their suffering. Their descendants carried the bitterness of betrayal, and in their chronicles, his image was harsh and unflinching. Outside of Wallachia, his reputation traveled swiftly through the printing presses of Europe. In the German states, pamphlets were published that described his cruelty in vivid detail. Some were based on reports from merchants and envoys. Others exaggerated freely, turning Vlad into a monster of near superhuman brutality. These pamphlets found eager readers, for tales of terror sold well, and the new technology of printing carried his name farther than any army ever could. In Italy, scholars and diplomats repeated the accounts, fascinated and horrified by the stories of impalements and punishments. To them, he was a symbol of the wild frontier, where civilization met barbarism, and where rulers held power through fear rather than law. In Hungary, his image was divided. Some remembered him as a difficult ally, too brutal to support openly. Others admired him as a defender of Christendom, a man who had dared to defy the Ottomans when so many bent their knee. In the Ottoman world, his name carried hatred, but also respect. To the Sultan and his men, he was a troublesome vassal who had refused submission, a rebel who had forced an empire to slow its advance. His impalements were remembered with horror, but also with a grudging recognition that fear can wound even the strongest of armies. As the centuries passed, the memory of Vlad Tepes shifted once again. In Romanian folklore, he was not remembered only as a cruel tyrant, but also as a just ruler, one who brought order, punished corruption, and defended his land with ferocity. Some tales painted him as a hero who fought for the independence of his people, whose severity was necessary in an age of betrayal and invasion. This dual memory, both tyrant and protector, remains in Romania even today, where his image is sometimes honored as a national symbol of resistance. But perhaps the most enduring transformation of Vlad's legacy came in the 19th century, with the pen of the Irish author Bram Stoker. In 1897, Stoker published his novel Dracula, a Gothic tale of a vampire count who lived in a Transylvanian castle, feeding on the blood of the living. Stoker drew upon scraps of history, legends of the Carpathian Mountains, and the ominous name of Dracula, once borne by Vlad's father, to shape his character. Though the Dracula of fiction was not Vlad himself, the connection was enough to fuse the two in the imagination of the world. The Impaler became the vampire, a prince who had ruled with terror became a creature of eternal night. Through Stoker's novel and the countless plays, films, and adaptations that followed, Vlad's name crossed into legend so completely that fact and fiction became inseparable. Today, when people hear the word Dracula, they may think first of fangs, of cloaks, of castles in the mist. But behind that image lies the memory of a 15th century ruler whose life was stranger and darker than any tale of the undead. His cruelty was real, his reign was bloody, and his enemies truly feared him. The vampire may be myth, but the man who inspired it walked the earth, fought his battles, and left behind a history that still unsettles those who read it. In the end, Vlad Tepes was many things. To some, he was a tyrant, to others a defender. To his enemies, he was a terror. To his people, he was both protector and executioner. To history, he is a figure balanced between truth and legend. And to the modern world, he is a reminder that the boundary between history and myth is thin, and that the stories we tell about power often outlive the men who held it. And so the story of Vlad Tepes, the Impaler, comes to its quiet close. A prince who rose and fell 3 times, who ruled with fear, and who left behind a name that echoed through history. His life was marked by cruelty, but also by defiance, by betrayals, but also by strength. From the dark forests of Wallachia, to the halls of European courts, to the pages of legends and novels, his image traveled farther than he could have imagined. Centuries later, he is remembered not only as a ruler of a small principality, but as a symbol of power, of terror, and of the thin line between history and myth. As you rest now, let the details of his story fade, like the echo of distant footsteps. Let the battles, the betrayals, and the legends settle into stillness. The voices of history are always with us, but they quiet themselves in the night. Thank you for listening, and may your dreams be lighter than the tales we leave behind.